Every town keeps its secret. In Hollowgate, the secret was time itself. At exactly 3:17, the clocks stopped, the bells stuttered, and the harbor held its breath. When Nora Hale returned home to bury her mother's past, she uncovered a debt measured not in money, but in minutes. The knock that comes at 3:17. I arrived in Hollowgate with the kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as lean, a slanted sheet that made the streetlights smear into luminous stalks. The cab left me at the corner. No one likes to go all the way down Bellwether Lane after dark. Not even for extra ferrand. I dragged my suitcase the last 100 yards under the hunched eaves of my mother's house. The place had been empty for a year and a half, but it still smelled like her. Lavender, starch, and the faint metallic temps of old coins. The porch clock, a thing of brass and vines, chimed once as I set down the key, then again half a minute later, as if reconsidering its own certainty. Inside, the house felt occupied by her absence. My mother had not been cruel. Exactly. Just precise. The kind of woman who could slice silence into perfect lengths and label the jars. Her mental was a regiment of small clocks, each corrected to the second, each gifted by the same man. Our Calver horologist etched on brass plates small as postage stamps. I'd grown up hearing his name like the rumor of an illness, something granular and slow. In Hollowgate, people spoke about time the way they spoke about weather. Personally, it was still early evening by the wall clock, 7:52, but I knew better. The airport had been delayed. The highway snarled. My body said the day was a frayed cord, sparkin'. I made tea in a kettle that complained, found a clean mug in a cupboard labeled mugs, and took stock. The estate was simple on paper. Sell the house, settle a few bills, dispose of belongings with no historical value per the lawyer's lined memo. I had planned to be methodical. That was before the knock. It came soft as a spoon on an eggshell. 3 taps. A space. Then 2. I checked the hall clock, 8:04, and opened the door to find no one. Only rain, and a thin envelope folded once and tucked between the slats. There was no address on it, just my name in the posture of a hand I didn't know. Inside was a key, small and ornate, teeth like a skyline. There was also a slip of paper with 5 typed words. Return what your mother kept. No signature, no instructions. The key was warm as if recently held. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the hedges and the dimming street. Hollowgate kept its secrets close, but the rain carried sound, and I heard it then. The steady tacking of a clock somewhere nearby, too loud for any single house. It was a sound the town wore like a second pulse, ordinary and unnerving at once. The rhythm felt slightly wrong. A canoe on a lake bumping just off the dock. It took me a minute to realize why the time on the hall clock bothered me. My phone read 9:12. The kitchen clock insisted 8:11. The mantel clocks were a choir arguing with themselves. One said 7:58, another 8:03. Another had stopped at 3:17, its second hand twitching in place like an insect pinned to cork. Power outages, I told myself. Humidity, but the faucets ran fine and the lamps were steady. And I knew, as the people of Hollowgate always had, that a wrong clock was rarely just a wrong clock. I called the number on the lawyer's memo and got his apologetic voicemail. I nearly called the cab company back to ask if the driver had seen anyone on the walk, but stopped myself. It would make me sound superstitious. And anyway, I hadn't come back to Hollow Gate to sound like my neighbors. I'd come because the letter from the hospital had been written in past tense. The house made the slow settling noises of a thing deciding to bear your weight. I walked the soft carpeted hallway toward my childhood bedroom, intending to stack belongings into sane piles. The door was half closed the way ID left it whenever ID visited in the last few years, and for a second I had the sensation I always had, that I was about to walk in on myself. It faded as I pushed the door wider and saw the bed stripped, the window lipped with condensation, the laced curtain lifting and settling as if quietly breathing. On the dresser, a photograph I hadn't known existed. My mother, younger by decades, smiling a private smile. Beside her, a man who had the kind of face you did draw if someone asked you to draw a man. Straight nose, eyes alert and unstartled, hair cut with arithmetic. He stood with his hands folded in front of him, a posture of waiting. On the back, in my mother's needle-fine script, opening to Calvert's, 1989. Hollow Gate had always had a clock shop. That's how people said it. The way they might say a town always had water or a road. Before Calvert, the shop had belonged to Mr. Fenimore, who specialized in grandfather clocks and opinions. Before that, it had been Master Ondix, whose cuckoos were rumored to tell you the hour of your death if you wound them backwards. People said a lot of things. The truth was that in Hollow Gate, clocks weren't metaphor. They were economy. Fishermen sold their catch by the tide. Factory workers, when there had been a factory, walked in and walked out by whistle. Even the church bells had been corrected every Tuesday by whomever kept the shop. A quiet barter. Precision for peace. I carried the photograph to the mantel and held it up to the stopped clock's face. The tic-tac-tic all around me made the silence of the 3:17 clock feel more deliberate, like a closed eye in a room of watchers. I set the photo down and tried the small brass key in the clock's bottom hatch out of reflex, though I knew the key I had found on the porch wasn't shaped for winding. It wasn't shaped for a door lock either, too elaborate. The shaft engraved with tiny chevrons, the bow cut into the negative of a crescent moon. Return what your mother kept, I whispered, and the house, which had the good manners of old things, didn't answer. The second knock came at a bad time for me. That is to say, when I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the first. I was on the floor, cross-legged among files, making a little island of receipts. The knock this time was louder, more certain. I stood, knees complaining, and opened the door, expecting some combination of wet teenager and dare. What I found was a woman a little older than me in a yellow slicker, her black hair pulled back with such severe neatness. It looked like a decision her hands made every hour. Nora Hale, she said, not like a question. Yes, I said, like one. Detective Mara Elif, she said, holding up the glow of a badge before tucking it away as if badged light shouldn't be left in the rain. I'm sorry to come late. I saw the taxi. She peered past me into the foyer. May I? A detective standing in the doorway on your first night back in your dead mother's house is either the beginning of a story you T1, or the middle of one you missed. I stepped aside. She shook rain from her sleeves in the neatest possible way and gave the mantel clocks a long, thoughtful look. The kind that suggested she counted things without moving her lips. "I'll be sure," she said. "Did you receive anything unexpected tonight? Package, note, visitor." "I received the rain," I said, then realized that sarcasm was a poor way to greet a woman who had probably spent her evening telling shivering people that their worries were worth formalizing. "Sorry, an envelope. May I see it?" I handed her the slip of paper and the key. The detective took them with the same clean, mechanical care with which she'd removed the badge. Practiced, kept within the rails, she glanced at the typed line, and something in her shoulders tightened. Maybe, or surrendered bravery. "You heard of him?" I asked. "Of who?" she said, but too quickly. "The clockmaker." I said, "Ah, Calvert. My mother knew him. Everyone knew him," she said, and the clock chorus seemed to lean closer. "Mr. Calvert has been missing for 11 months. Missing?" I repeated. I almost said, like my mother. But that wasn't fair to death. Missing was a verb that puts you in the middle of your own vanishing. Detective Aleve turned the key in her fingers, studying the engraved chevrons. "We've had a series of call-them incidents, odd burglaries. Nothing taken, nothing misplaced. But in each case, the resident returned to find the clocks in the home all set to the same time." She tipped her head at my 3:17 clock. "Sometimes exactly that." "Why 3:17? "We don't know," she said. "We don't know if it's a signature or a sentence. And you think whoever's doing this brought me the key and a command." I said, "Return what your mother kept." "I think," she said, and her voice flattened into something more official, "that if people in this town begin receiving instructions in their own homes, I would like to know why." She looked around again, as if the reason might be sitting in one of the house's corners like a cat. "Did your mother keep anything unusual? Anything from Mr. Calvert? The photograph on the dresser, the clocks, the strange way my mother had corrected time as if it were a hurt child." I thought of the empty room down the hall with the box marked, "To be done later," that had never been done. "She kept everything," I said, which was the truest answer. "I haven't looked yet. You'll let me know if you find something that matches that key," she said, slipping it carefully into an evidence sleeve she produced from inside her coat, as if sleeves knew what nights were for, or if you receive any other messages. "And if I simply leave again?" I asked. "Go back to the city." "You could," she said, "but I don't recommend forfeiting possession of your own minutes." It was the sort of sentence I would have teased the city detectives for. Metaphor, pretending to be warning, but here, with rain counting the porch slats and the mantel clocks underrunning and overrunning themselves, it didn't feel like poetry. It felt like currency. After she left, I did what people do when they are afraid and alone in the places where they used to be. Children. I went looking for my mother. I went looking for the places where she had pressed herself into the house, as seems in the pantry, behind the flour bins. I found the ledger where she used to keep lists of who had borrowed dishes and who had returned them, and who would be temporarily excluded from future In the sewing room, I found a drawer of buttons that gleamed like a jar of small, watchful eyes, and in the whole closet, behind the winter coats, and the umbrella with a broken rib, I found the box marked to be done later. Later had come and gone. Inside were notebooks, the cheap composition kind, bound with rubber bands like arrested birds. The top one was labeled Corrections. The first page was dated 5 years ago and covered in my mother's small, fussy script. The kitchen clock now gains 37 seconds every hour, exactly, corrected daily at 6 p.m. The porch clock loses 10 seconds every hour after noon. The mantel clock leftmost insists on 3:17 unless the door is held open. There were pages and pages of timings, litanies of adjustment. In one entry, she had sketched the gear train of the stopped mantel clock, notations pointing to teeth worn, smooth as if by tongue. In another, she had written Mr. Calvert's name in the margin and then crossed it out with an agitation unusual for her self-respecting lines. At the bottom of the third notebook, tucked between 2 pages, was a receipt from Calvert's Horology, dated 11 months, and 1 week ago, the item was listed as settlement. No amount. No description, just that word, printed with the clean finality of a period. On the back, in a hand that was definitely not my mother's and didn't match the front, was a note. Until the debt is satisfied, all accounts shall be corrected to 3:17. The room's temperature seemed to drop by a degree that was not measurable, but could be felt by nerve and nerve alone. "What dead?" I asked the acquainted air. "Whose accounts?" A hum started up behind me, soft as a throat clearing in a polite theater. I turned. The 3:17 clock's second hand, which had been twitching in its pinned way, eased forward with the relief of a muscle finally released. It made 2 full, confident sweeps. Then, with the deliberation of a hand placing a note on a table, the minute hand tipped to 3:18. I wanted to call someone. The detective. The lawyer. Any old friend who would answer. Instead, I did something I could pretend was rational. I put the receipt and the notebooks back in the box, carried them to the dining table, and made neat stacks. I told myself I would catalog them in the morning. Then I did another rational thing. I decided to sleep. It was almost midnight by my phone. The house had a guest room, but I went to my childhood bed because something in me felt negotiated with. I drew the old quilt up to my chin and watched the lace curtain lift and settle like the slow breath of a thinking animal. The mantel clocks sounded their arguments through the wall in muffled ticks. I told myself I would buy new clocks in the morning and solve nothing, which would feel like doing something, but sleep is not persuaded by lists. It comes when it's paid, and sometimes the debt is fear. The feeling I'd had since opening the door that I had walked into the middle of my own story without being informed of the plot, thickened into that particular heaviness we call dread. It is not the fear that something will happen. It is the fear that something has already happened and you are only now catching up. I woke to a sound that did not belong in my house. A soft, consistent chirp, the kind of electronic nag a smoke alarm makes when it wants you to change its battery. I sat up, heart in my hands, and listened. Chirp. A pause. Chirp. The sound came from the hallway. I slid from bed and opened the door. In the hall, the 3:17 clock was ticking with soft satisfaction. On the floor, beneath it, lay the porch key in its evidence sleeve, and my mother's photograph with Calvert. The photograph had been folded in half along a crease that put his face on the inside and hers on the outside. I hadn't heard the door open. The front latch was still set. Every window I could see from the hall wore its black rain like a closed eye. I picked up the key. The evidence sleeve had been clean when the detective slid it in. Now it bore a gray dusting on the inside, as if the key had been dipped in ash. I touched the plastic and my fingers tingled as if the air around the metal had a different opinion about electricity. The chirp sounded again, more insistent. It wasn't a smoke alarm, I realized. It was a digital watch alarm. The kind you had to set on purpose and then forget to unset. It was coming from the closet. I opened it and found the watch at once, a cheap plastic thing with a cracked band sitting on top of the to-be-done-later box like a crown. The face blinked 3:17 in square green segments. It chirped and chirped and chirped, and then, as if it had finally received confirmation that someone had received its message, it stopped under the watch, on the very top of the notebook stack. There was fresh handwriting in a small square of space my mother's neatness had left blank. It wasn't hers. The script was careful, almost schoolboyish, like someone practicing a mask. Nora, that is yours now? Código. I sat on the floor because my legs decided, without consulting me, that they didn't want to participate in whatever stood-up behavior I had planned. Sweat pebbled my upper lip, though the hallway wasn't warm. Debt. In my life in the city, debt had always been a number you could name and therefore negotiate. There were people you could call, and payment plans you could arrange, and interest rates you could resent. But this debt felt older, like something you paid with the steady coin of days. The house's quiet grew loud. My phone vibrated where I'd left it on the dresser, and I lurched toward the sound like a person reprieved. The caller ID said unknown. I answered because people do. Because we are addicted to the possibility of a voice that explains things. "Miss Hale," said a man, his voice calm and clear and unfashionably precise. It was the kind of voice that could sell you a watch that would decide how you remembered your own life. I trust the Kiaraya. "Mr. Calvert," I said, because naming a ghost makes it less likely. A pause that was either surprise or calculation. "We've met," he said. "When you were a little girl, I fitted your mother's mantle clock." His voice softened for a syllable and then returned to its factory settings. "She was a punctual woman." I admired that. "She's dead," I said. "Is that punctual?" "It was on time," he said. Not early, not late. I have a detective who would like to admire you in handcuffs, I said, and I was pleased to hear my own voice find its old angles. She says you've been missing. Missing, he repeated, tasting the word and finding it acceptable. I have merely been elsewhere. Time is a neighborhood with many streets. What do you want? I said. To conclude a transaction begun before your mother's appointment at the hospital, he said. We had an understanding. Unfortunately, she could not complete her. What did she keep? I asked. What am I supposed to return? Minutes, he said simply. A small number, stolen in a necessary way. But stolen? The account must balance. A pause, and then a tone of courtesy so polished it reflected even my doubt. You will find, Ms. Hale, that I am not a cruel bookkeeper. I never take what cannot be spared. The key will open what is owed. Return what your mother kept, and your clocks will run true. And if I don't, then the accounts will correct themselves another way, he said gently. As they always do. The line clicked and went dead, and I knew, without knowing how I knew, that I would not be able to call him back. I also knew that my skin had registered his last sentence as a draft, and that somewhere inside me a blank had been filled with a wind. I stood very still in the hole. The house breathed. The 3:17 clock ticked with the smugness of an arithmetic that knows it will be right eventually. I looked at the key again, at the engraved chevrons, and thought of shapes. The negative space of the crescent moon in the bow. The unknown lock that would match. There are games every town plays with its own superstition. Hollowgate's favorite was 3 places you don't go after midnight. They changed over the years. Children grew into teenagers and traded one dare for another. But 3 remained on the list since before I was born. The flagstone path behind the church that led down to the tidal flats. The old Hobbs quarry with its black water, and Calvert's. Because when he closed his shop at 6, it was said the windows kept ticking inside even when no one wound them. I dressed in jeans and a sweater and pulled on my coat. The rain had gentled, less a sheet now than a veil, and the streetlight hummed. The air smelled like iron and the ocean's old purse. I stepped into it with the key in my pocket and my mother's photograph in my bag, as if paper could vouch for me. The town didn't feel abandoned, it just decided. A dog barked 3 streets over, and someone's TV bled a laugh track into the mist as if the tech had been miscalibrated, and all joy had shifted half a block east. Calvert sat, at the end of Hollow Street, where the shops thinned and the harbor widened its mouth. The windows were exactly as I remembered. Mullioned, neat, their displays arranged with a care that had always felt like a politeness extended to those who did not understand care. In the right-hand window, a tall skeleton clock paraded its gears like a man pleased to be seen working. In the left, a cluster of carriage clocks, like domestic animals, posed for portraits. The door was painted green so dark it was almost black, and the glass bore the painted words by appointment in a hand steadier than morality. At 6, the lights would have gone out. Now, near midnight, the shop would be dark as the inside of an eyelid, except it wasn't. There was a low, pulsing glow, the kind a night watchman's lantern might make if such a watchman believed it was vulgar to be obvious. I approached the door, my heart keeping an inventory. I didn't expect the key to fit the door. It didn't. The lock was a standard deadbolt that had been polished by years of use. My key was wrong for it in every way, but the door had a mail slot, and above it, embossed into the wood, almost invisible under the dark paint, was a small crescent moon. The key's bow was a negative crescent, the engraving on the chef servante's little arrow zest, a question. I bent, slid the key into the mail slot, not as a key but as an offering, and pressed. Something inside the door answered with a soft click, intimate as breath. The deadbolt did not turn. The door did not swing, but a panel to the right of the frame eased inward a fraction, like a mouth parting to say yes. Behind it, a second door waited, a skin beneath a skin. This door had no handle and no lock I could see. It had only a clock face set flush into the wood where a doorknob might be. The hands were stopped at 3:17. As I watched, the second hand, which had not moved since the detective left my hall, twitched, tested the air, then climbed with a tiny, satisfied step to 3:18. Some debts are numbers, some are directions. I put my hand flat against the clock face. It was cool and very clean. I felt the hum rather than heard it, a narrow, bright frequency, as if a tuning fork had been struck in a room beneath my feet. "Return what your mother kept," I said, aloud this time, to the door, to the town, to the idea of myself as someone who could still leave. The second door slid open with a hush like a careful thought, and I stepped into the clockmaker's shop at a time of night when no one decent was supposed to. The light inside was not light, it was the pale suggestion of light, the implication of it, as if luminescence were a religion and the shop was a very old believer. The first thing I noticed was the smell oil and brass and something sweet, like pears left in a drawer. The second thing was the noise, ticking. Yes, but more than ticking. A soft species of speech, a whispering made by 1,000 small agreements. On the central workbench lay a ledger, open to the same word that was printed on my mother's receipt. Settlement. Beneath it, in ink so black it made other blacks ashamed, was my mother's name. And under that, in a delicate column ruled by a hand that believed in lines as proof against chaos, there was a list. 11 minutes. Borrowed. 41 minutes. Borrowed. 3 minutes. Borrowed 10 minutes. Borrowed 22 minutes. Borrowed. No returns were recorded. At the bottom of the page was a total 87 minutes. I touched the number. The air around it stiffened as if offended by the oil of my skin. Behind the bench, against the back wall, stood a case made of glass that wasn't glass. Inside it, like butterflies pinned beneath labels, floated thin, round vials, each no bigger than a coin. They contained not liquid, not air, but the impression of something caught and held. The nearest was labeled Ms. A. Broom, 14 minute. Another, S. Bloom, 3 minutes. The labels went on, name after name, minute after minute, as if the town had been skimming small change from its own pockets for years. I searched for my mother, found her at once. Margaret Hay, 87 minute. The vial was empty. The room seemed to lean, then right itself politely. I looked back at the ledger. Someone had drawn a small symbol beside my mother's name. A crescent laid on its back like a smile. The same symbol as Dickie's bow. Behind me, a floorboard spoke in a fluent creak. I turned too fast, bumping the bench, and the ledger slid a fraction to reveal a second object lying beneath. A photograph, twin to the one in my bag. My mother and Calvert on opening day. Only in this one, her smile was less private, and his eyes, which I had taken for ordinary, were not. There were a color the photograph could not quite hold, like a shade invented between two other shades. "Nora?" said a voice that had recently called me on a phone. It came from a door at the back, the kind of door that would look unremarkable in any room, but looked sinister in a room that had already revealed more than rooms should. "Please come in. We must not keep time waiting. I should have run." I know that now in the way people know facts about their own pasts. Rationally and too late. But at that moment, the math of my decisions felt very clean. My mother had borrowed minutes. They were owed. I had a key. A ledger had said my name. The door at the back opened without being touched, and a smell like rain on old stone came through, and I stepped forward because the story I believed myself to be in had a slope and I was on it. As the door closed behind me, the front room's whispering dimmed to a distant, continuous approval. The hallway beyond was narrow, tunneled by shelves on which rested items that were not clocks but had opinions about time. Sandglasses that held grains black as pepper, metronomes with their arms held at strange angles like frozen dancers, a child-esque mobile whose planets turned backwards and then righted themselves in a patient rehearsal for calamity. The floor slanted slightly downward, the way floors do in places that have decided to settle into their own weight. "Your mother came to me when the diagnosis arrived," Mr. Calvert said. He stood at the end of the hall with his hands folded in the posture of waiting I remembered from the photograph. He looked exactly as he had then, which was either a trick of light or a trick of who he was. Not because she feared death, she feared the size of the goodbye. "What did you sell her?" I asked. My voice sounded steady, which was a kindness it lent me. "I don't sell time," he said, almost offended. "I correct it." I lent her minutes taken from those who were wasting them. to be returned when they were needed less. He smiled, and the smile was both generous and hungry. She used them well. Last walks. A pie with too much lemon. A letter to you, she wrote with attention, instead of haste. I thought of the letter that had reached me 2 days after the funeral, the one that, and had said only, I needed more time to say less. What I want is always smaller than the shape I make to hold it. I had folded it and unfolded it until the crease was white as bone. She died anyway, I said. On time, he said, not early, not late. And now you want her minutes back. I want balance, he said. The town wants it too, though they don't always admit it. A place like this loses itself when its clocks don't agree. He gestured toward a small table on which lay an object shaped like a music box. The key you received opens one thing in this shop. When you turn it, the account will balance. Your mother's debt will be returned by you as her heir. I looked at the music box more closely. It was made of dark wood, inlaid with a crescent of pearl. The keyhole in its face was shaped like the negative of a moon. The chevrons on the shaft of my key would seat perfectly. What happens when I turn it? I asked. The minutes she borrowed returned to the stream, he said softly. From you. I stared at him. From me. You bear her name, he said, and I knew he meant it in a way the DMV did not. It is not painful, he added, as if pain were the primary objection, and not the idea that my life could be parceled into salvageable slivers. You will not even notice. Time is full of such small corrections. The city steals your minutes with traffic. Lovers do the same with a story told longer than necessary. This is simply behind him, in the distance of the hall. A door or a wall or a thought shifted. Why 317? I asked. Because I needed to keep him speaking, and also because the number had begun to fill the corners of my vision. The way after images do after you look at a light too long. Because 317 is when most people regret and most people forgive, he said. You'll find that a town's attention opens, then like a gate. It sounds like a superstition, I said. It is a measurement, he said, and his voice had the crispness of a knife revealing fruit. I picked up the key. It was warm again. The music box waited, its inlay catching what little light the shop allowed. If I turn it, I said, the debt is paid, yes. And if I don't, then the clocks will ask again, he said. And again? They are tireless beggars. I thought of Detective Eve, of her precise hair and precise questions. I thought of my mother at the table with me 2 years ago, her hand moving over a grocery list with a concentration that felt like love. I thought of the ledger with names that were not mine. Miss a Broom, people who had given or been taken from in amounts that could fit into a lunch hour. I thought of how easy it had been at the airport to lose 40 minutes to the kind of delay that feels like no one as fault, and therefore everyone as 87 minutes. I said, that's what she borrowed. It is not much, he said, except when it is. The house at my back, the town at my back, the night at my back, all leaned forward, curious. I slid the key into the music box. It seated with a soft promise. The chevrons found their counterparts. The bow lay like a moon cradled in a dark sky. Return what your mother kept, I said, because saying the sentence made me feel like a person who could choose. Then I turned the key. The box did not play. It breathed. A rush of air like opening a door to a stormless day filled the narrow hall. I felt it in my teeth and my knees and the coin of my belly where we keep old fears. The shop brightened, not with light, but with a finer shadow. The air tasted briefly of pears. The ledger in the other room turned a page by itself. Somewhere, the 3:17 clock smiled, and I felt something lead me quick and not unkind. Like someone taking a hair from your head to thread a needle. I waited for the stagger that would mark the subtraction. It did not come. What came instead was a sense impossible to describe without sounding like the kind of woman who sorted her silences into jars, that a notch had been carved into my hours, so that they might fit more snugly together. Mr. Calvert inclined his head the way men do when something goes as expected, and they are pleased with their own geometry. Thank you, he said softly. Your mother would have liked that you did it with your eyes open. What did I just give you? I asked, and though I knew the answer was minutes, the word felt incomplete, like explaining a house by saying it has doors. 87 of them, he said, from the end, where you will not miss them until you need them. His smile did not show teeth. I am not cruel. I thought of the ledger again, of the case, with its vials, of the rules by which this man's life was arranged. And now, I said, we're done. For this account, he said, but the town keeps many ledgers. Ms. Hawley, he nodded toward the front room, where the clocks were likely busy coming to an agreement they had been denied for months. Listen. I did. The ticking had changed. Not louder, not softer, simply consonant. The marks of 1,000 pens finally writing in the same direction on the same line. It should have been comforting. It felt like a smile on the wrong face. Go home, he said. Sleep. Tomorrow, bring me the notebook. We keep our records better than the living. I stood, the key still in my hand, and the music box like a cooled animal between us. There is a moment in every story where the reader wants to warn the woman not to do the thing she is doing. I was inside the book. I did the thing. When I stepped back into the night, Hollowgate's rain had stopped. The town's windows were dark and agreed with one another. The streetlight over Bellwether Lane hummed in the tone of an appliance that knows it is needed. I walked home with 87 fewer minutes on the end of my life, and though they were gone, the shape of them pressed against me like something carried and put down for now. Inside, the mantel clocks ticked like a chorus taking a breath in unison. The hall clock read 12:11, and so did my phone. The stopped clock in the hall, which had pretended paralysis all evening, had corrected itself without apology. It did not seem triumphant. It seemed relieved. On the dining table, The notebook labeled corrections lay open to a fresh page. In the space at the top, where my mother would have put a date, something had written itself in a neat hand that was not mine. Account settled for now by agreement of parties present. R. Calvert. I closed the notebook. I closed the door to my bedroom. I closed my eyes, and just before sleep found me, I heard the sound of someone walking in my mother's kitchen with bare feet, as if pacing out a recipe, counting quietly. Not a ghost, a neighbor, a clock, a debt that had not finished naming itself. Tomorrow, I would bring the notebooks to the shop. Tomorrow, Detective Eleve would knock at 3:17. Exactly. Tomorrow, the town would begin to decide whether it liked being corrected. But tonight, in the held breath after an agreement and before its bill, I slept. And in my sleep, I dreamt of a room where minutes floated like coins in a fountain, just out of reach, and a man with a ledger saying on time as if it were a blessing and a boundary both. The missing hour, I woke to the smell of coffee I had not made and the sound of a knock that knew what it was doing. 3 taps. A space. Then 2. It was still dark enough that the window held only my reflection and a small hurrying of rain, though the rain, I realized, had stopped hours ago. The hall clock read 3:17. I was at the door before my fear had a chance to pose. Detective Nora Hale stood on the porch with her badge already in her hand, like an apology she happened to find useful. "You're early," I said, because no hour after midnight and before sunrise belongs to anyone decent. "I'm on time," she said, and, without looking at the hall clock, added, "May I?" I let her in. The house accepted her like an instrument accepts the player who knows where the notes are. She glanced at the mantel on sweep. Quick assessment then at the dining table where the notebooks sat like obedient students waiting to be called on. She noticed everything without having to make a point of noticing it. "Coffee," I said, because my mouth wanted to be a host, while the rest of me rehearsed a confession. "I shouldn't," she said, which is what people say when they mean yes. "Thank you." In the kitchen, I filled the kettle. The light over the sink took a dignified second to decide to be useful. We stood in the kind of silence that collects in kitchens at unreasonable hours, the quiet of machines that are off but capable. "Something happened last night," I said. "Something always happens around 3, she said. She did not look at her watch. The gesture would have been vulgar in this town. "Tell me your version," I told her. The envelope, the key, the typed instruction, the first visit, the ledger in my mother's closet, and the receipt that said settlement with no amount, as if the price of something important had been paid in a currency without numbers. Calvert's call, the shop that would not open and then did, the case of vials and the empty one with my mother's name, the music box, the key, the 87 minutes lifted from the end of my life like bled air. I tried to tell it without drama, as if reading her a recipe I had followed exactly. She listened the way some people pray, with their eyes open and their skepticism busy counting. When I described the vials, her mouth made a narrow shape that wasn't a smile and was a not one. "Did you bring the notebooks there?" she asked when I'd finished. "No," I said. I promised I would today. She nodded. Don't. Because you don't want me participating in a crime, I said. Because I don't. Want to hand him the index to your mother's mind? She said. We don't know what he wants beyond balance. And balance is a word people use when they mean power and want to sound benevolent. The kettle exhaled. I poured water over grounds and found 2 clean mugs in the cupboard labeled mugs, because my mother had preferred the world to be literal. I set them on the counter between us like 2 small, heated truths. Why? 317, I asked. He gave me an answer. It was tidy. I don't believe tidy. I have 3 theories, she said, and drank. The first is that he is a narcissist and chose an hour that no one else would want, so he could own it. The second is that he found a weak seam in the town some time of night psychogeography where sleep is thinned. He uses it the way thieves use, a window left cracked. The third is less satisfying. Something happened to him at 317, and he's making the rest of us participate in his anniversary. Which do you believe? I asked. People like him prefer seams, she said. Personal anniversaries are too sentimental to be useful. People like him. You talk about him as if you've been doing this a while, I said. I grew up 3 towns over, she said. We didn't have a clockmaker. We had a woman who made charms that cured headaches that were really bad marriages. People came out of her house feeling better, and then the feeling wore off. The way weather wears off. There's a type, they find something invisible that the rest of us want to believe is negotiable. They sell us the negotiation. She set the mug down with surgical care. What did it feel like giving him the minutes? Quick, I said. Not cruel. That's how they ensure consent the next time, she said. If it were obvious theft, the town would have burned him down 12 mayors ago. You think there will be a next time? I don't think your mother was his first account, she said, and I don't think he stays satisfied. A clock somewhere in the house cleared its throat. The hall face read 3:24. The 2 of us looked at it at once and then at each other as if caught admiring something indecent. Why are you here at this hour? I asked. Because between 3 and 4, the town reports the most, she said. People wake and decide they were brave enough to be worried, they call. They tell me about stopped clocks and opened windows and notes typed on old machines. I file them and smile and go to the places I can go and wait for a person like you to say something specific, enough to cross the line between weird and actionable. And am I actionable? You're more than a rumor, she said. And you're willing to walk into rooms that would make better stories than choices? You want to arrest him? I said. I want to locate him, she said. Then I want to write a report that uses words like unlicensed and fraud, which will be wrong but adequate. Then I want to watch the town decide whether it wants him gone or only less obvious. Bring a warrant, I said. He hides doors inside doors. I'll bring bolt cutters, she said. It should have sounded like a joke. It didn't. She rose, and the house watched her stand. You said you promised to bring him the notebooks, she said. Keep your promise. But don't bring the notebooks. What do I bring? A copy, she said. Not of the words, of the ritual. He believes in the form more than the content. People like him do. She pulled a small card from her pocket and wrote a number on the back. If you go, I'll be nearby. If he asks you to sign anything, don't. If he gives you anything to drink, don't. Tell him you'll return at 3:17 tomorrow. She paused. He won't like that, which is why you should say it. After she left, 317 felt like a room I had just left and could not re-enter without impoliteness. The house loosened its attention. I sat with the notebooks and a cup of coffee cooling into the temperature of regret. The ledger correction still lay open to last night's neat declaration. Account settled for. Now. I turned the page. My mother's script filled it. A new column of times and small exasperations with machinery as stubborn as people. In the margin, beside an entry for the porch clock, she had drawn a tiny crescent moon. It wasn't a note. It was a habit. By daylight, the punctual, domestic kind that respects calendars. The house felt less haunted and more old. A truck down the block started with the cough of someone vouching for it. The harbor fog burned itself thin in the east. I made eggs and did not taste them. At 8, which agreed with 8, I took the notebooks to the dining table and began to copy. Detective Elive was right about people like him. They reverence the shape of ceremony. They like to be shown that the world can be a system if we only obey its forms. I found brown paper and twine in the pantry. I made a bundle the way my mother would have made one. Corners squared, edges kissed with tape only where tape could apologize for itself. I wrote on the top in a small, fussy hand that was not mine, but could pass. Corrections. Then, just to see what it felt like, I drew a crescent in the lower right corner where my mother's habit would place it. The crescent looked back at me as if entertained. At 10, I called the lawyer and left a message that said, I am retrieving items from my mother's effects that may have historical value after all. Please advise. It was the kind of message that would make him briefly useful to me tomorrow and entirely useless now. I called no one else. There was no one else to call who would not say Dontigo and mean go faster. On the walk to the shop, the time practiced to normal. A boy with a backpack rode his bike too fast down Hollow Street and survived. Mrs. Larkin from the bakery hosed the sidewalk with the smug air of someone who already risen at 4 and 1. Two men argued about docks the way men argue when they are talking about something else. The wind lifted the halyards and made the moored boats clink like polite cutlery. If you asked me then whether the town wanted to be corrected, I would have said yes, and meant. It wants to be itself and needs someone else to tell it how. Calvert's looked closed. It also looked as if closed were a suggestion it knew how to refuse. The green door held its dark as a choice. I knocked because a knock was a kind of courtesy he would value, even as he ignored it. The door did not open. The panel to the right side inward, a fraction like yesterday. Inside, the shop's light made its patient, persuasive case for itself. The whispering in the front room had changed further. The consonants had deepened. A harmony achieved and now rehearsed. I set the brown paper bundle on the central bench exactly where I defound the ledger last night and said, aloud, because he liked ritual corrections. "Good morning, Mizzy," said Mr. Calvert from the back room, and his voice carried the clean brightness of glass. "Washed often, you kept your promise. I brought what you asked for," I said, which was true at the level of grammar if not at the level of soul. "The notebooks." He stepped into the doorway and arranged his hands in their folded geometry. In daylight horror, what the shop considered daylight he was less myth. He had a widow's peak that made an arrow of his forehead a mouth that could be both kind and exacting in the same syllable, and the kind of posture that had been practiced as a child in front of mirrors or disapproving fathers. He looked at the bundle the way a collector looks at an auction lot he has already decided to win. "May?" he asked, which was polite of him, and also ritual. "You may," I said. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he walked to the glass-not-glass case and touched it with the mild affection reserved for objects that have obeyed. He did not glance at my mother's label. He did not need to. "You slept," he said. "Not a question." "I did," I said. "Good," he said. Transactions unsettle the nervous system. Sleep is the body's way of reconciling its books. He returned to the bench and loosened the twine with a small, precise knife. When he lifted the top sheet of brown paper and saw the cover, I had capit corrections in my mother's neat. Letterform's eyes softened. "It is a fine thing," he said, almost to himself, "to see a discipline survive its practitioner." He opened the notebook. The pages were blank. I had made a choice at the table that morning with the stubbornness that makes daughters daughters. I had copied the form. I had preserved the habit of the crescent. I had carried the weight as if it were the same weight. I had denied him the words. Mr. Calvert did not frighten easily. He did not startle now. He looked at the blank pages with an expression I could not read and then closed the cover as if I had made a clever pun. When he looked up, his politeness had not changed. Something else had. "You are your mother's child," he said. "That's the point," I said. "She taught me that information is a kind of knife. You don't hand it to a stranger blade first." "I am not a stranger," he said. "I have arranged the minutes of your family since before you could tell a second from a minute. You have arranged them to your advantage," I said. He tilted his head the way people do when they are deciding how much of their true face to show. "I have arranged them to the towns," he said. A place like this calcifies if you don't soften it with change. People cannot bear to give up anything all at once. They must be persuaded to surrender a moment here, a sliver there. That is my work. I correct it. I return disorder to its courses. At a price, I said, at the only price that matters. He said, time. His gaze moved to the case and back to me. You came to give me the shape of a promise and not the promise itself. That is a modern habit. Consider it a down payment on honesty. I said, you wanted the ritual. I performed it. Now I want something back. Ah, he said, pleased. A negotiation. The vial with my mother's name is empty, I said. But the ledger showed her debt unpaid last night. I paid it. I want to know where the minutes went. They returned, he said. The stream reclaimed what had been diverted. Minutes don't pile up like coins. They do what water does when you remove an obstruction. Into whose life? I said. He smiled. Wrong question. Then give me a better one. Ask where the obstruction went, he said mildly. His eyes flicked toward my hands. May I see your key? It isn't mine, I said. It's the town's. We share custody, he said. Let me show you something you won't like. He reached under the bench and brought out an object I had mistaken last night for a scale. It was a scale, but not for weight. 2 shallow dishes hung from a central arm engraved with the same quiet crescent. In one dish lay a single brass disc smaller than a penny. In the other, nothing. Place your key here, he said, indicating the empty dish. I'll get it back, I said. You will, he said. The instrument is not acquisitive. I placed the key. The arm dipped deftly and then found poise not at level but a degree off, as if balance had been redefined by a person with a ruler and an argument. What am I looking at? I asked. Debt, he said, or if you prefer the language of parishioners. Confession. 87 minutes, I said. He shook his head. Those 60s. And the 27 you do not yet know about. I looked at him. Your mother's ledger shows her borrowings. It does not show her returns, he said. Not the ones she paid in coin and not the ones she paid in kind. Coin, I said. Not money, he said. Favor. A bent schedule, a rescheduled harvest. A rain that arrived when it was asked to. She was a force in this town before she was my client, Ms. Hale. She learned my grammar quickly. My mother committed fraud on behalf of the weather. I said, call it stewardship, he said gently. Farmers keep different books than shopkeepers. He nodded at the dip of the scale. Last night's return. Corrected 8. The remaining 27 are not hers. They're mine, I said. It wasn't a question. I had recognized the feeling since before he named it. The press of absence on the far end of something that had been mine, and was now the stream takes its due from what is nearest. He said, "Inheritance is efficient. My mother never would have I began, and then stopped. You can't finish that sentence truthfully about anyone you love. You, Dante, know what they would have done when the door opened on a room you never had to see. You paid willingly," he said, "and you will not notice the absence until you are counting the last of anything." "I've noticed already," I said. I woke at 3:17 for a knock that was already at the door. "That isn't minutes," he said, and for the first time, his voice warmed enough to confuse me. "That's attention." "It is more expensive." "What do you want from me today?" I said, "because when you cannot arrest the man, you may at least force him to state his price. To see your mother's hand in this small machinery she tended," he said, tapping the blank cover of my counterfeit notebook with a knuckle that sounded on the paper as if on wood. "To learn where the drift is strongest now that she is gone, there will be a surge. People get greedy when the clocks agree. They think agreement means there is extra." He looked at the door, not at me. "There is never extra. Tell me about the burglaries," I said, because Detective Ilyev's caution had been a shadow at my shoulder all morning. Homes entered, clocks changed, nothing taken. "What confidence," he said. He and the pronoun was both accurate and too small. Wants the town to remember who moderates what they fear. He wants them to wake and consult their hours like scripture and feel a hand has smoothed the pages. He let the smallest impatience crease his mouth. "You are a journalist. You know what Notice Me looks like when it wears a disguise. Are you talking about yourself in the third person?" I asked. "I am talking about work," he said. "Not about the man who does it." From the street outside came the small commotion of someone dropping a crate and swearing in the soft way people swear when clumsiness is their own and they don't want to share it. The shop's whispering did not alter its faith. "What happens at 3:17 today?" I asked. "The same thing that happens every day," he said. "Someone will forgive and someone will regret, and I will turn a key in a lock you cannot see." He looked at me with a consideration that could have been kindness. "Unless someone interrupts me." "Detective Eleve," I said. "She is punctual," he said. "Her hair is the public face of her appetite for order." "You don't like being interrupted," I said. "I don't like waste," he said. "Interruptions spill minutes on the floor." "Here's my counteroffer," I said. "Because negotiations require the charade of parody, I bring you the real notebooks after I know what you want with them. And after I know you LL. Stop visiting houses at night like a polite plague. You tell me what my mother paid you for besides minutes? And how many of those favors are still owed by people who think they re-square? And you stop charging my account for debts I didn't agree to inherit." He listened with an attention that was not flattering and not unkind. When I finished, he said, "You came to me last night because your mother would have. You are bargaining this morning because you think words might be a currency here. They are not. They are receipts." He nudged the scale a millimeter with the back of his hand. "Come back at 3:17 with whatever faith you can afford. I will show you the missing hour." "What missing hour?" I said. He did not answer. He walked to the door and, in a gesture that could have been gallantry, if it hadn't been also rehearsal, held it for me. I stepped out into a town that had already decided 13 things about today before I woke. The door closed behind me with the quiet of a well-phrased argument. On the sidewalk, the traffic of small lives performed itself. Mrs. Larkin had stacked her trays. The boy with the backpack was already at school committing the sacred sin of thinking about other things. I stood there for a moment with the counterfeit notebook under my arm and tried to think like a person who could leave. My phone did not ring. I called no one. At noon, the harbor smell came inland, the way it does when the tide remembers us. At 1, the clouds sat down on the low hills and did not stand up again. At 2:45, I left the house and walked toward the shop against a wind that had opinions. I called Detective Aleve and said, "I'll be there at 3:17. "Stand in the doorway," she said. "Don't be heroic." "I'm not," I said. "Good," she said, and hung up in the kind of way that means I'll be there first. At 3:12, the street had the narrow hush of a chapel before an organ. A gull practiced an insult and gave up. The green door was closed, the panel unyielding. I stood, bundle under my arm like a choice. At 3:14, Detective Aleve appeared at the corner, not hurrying. She did not look at me. She looked at the shop as if it were a person about to tell a lie, and she was interested in the way it would do it. She nodded once at the air, which in this town functioned as witness. 3:15, 3:16. The seconds took on that particular length they borrow when watched. At 3:17 exactly, the panel slid in with a small, private yes. "Doorway," she reminded me, and we stepped together into the mouth of the shop and stopped. It was brighter than morning. The light came from no visible source, and all of them. "Mr. Calvert," she said, as if greeting a judge and a baker. "Detective," he said, from the back, as if greetings were things he had purchased and kept tidy. "Punctual. You said you'd show me the missing hour," I told him, and he said, "I said I'd show her," and lifted his chin toward the detective. It was a kind of pettiness that lets you measure a man even when he thinks he is measuring you. "Then show us both," Mara said, and moved farther in. Not to the bench, not to the case, but to a place against the wall where the baseboards were slightly scuffed. She ran a thumb over the mark and then looked at her thumb. "This door opens often," she said. 3:17, he said. "You keep a door all day to open it for a minute?" she asked. "An hour," he said. "But not here." The door in the wall moved the way bookshelves move in stories when someone pulls the correct book. It revealed not a hallway, but a room that refused to be seen all at once. The air in it had a smallness, like preserved weather. He gestured us in and did not precede us. It could have been courtesy. It could have been caution. The room was circular, the ceiling cupped overhead like a dome. Around us, at equal intervals, were 12 stations. Not clocks, and not instruments. At each a small pendulum, or a pair of thin tuning forks, or a shallow bowl of sand with a thin rod poised over it like a diviner waiting to choose where to point. In the center of the room, a platform the size of a manhole cover held a metal disc engraved with rings of numbers. The numbers did not match each other. They shared a language and argued about grammar. "This is where the town goes when it thinks it is asleep," he said, and it was almost gentle. "The extra is not extra. It is mislaid. We help it find its owner. Please?" He nodded to the platform. "Stand there, Miss Hale." "I did because he wanted me to. I did because I needed to understand the thing I'd already given a piece of my life to." The disc was cold through my soles. The air around my shoulders changed temperature in a way that wasn't weather. The instruments around the room began to answer one another, each with its discreeter voice, like people telling the same story from different ends of the table. "What happens now?" Detective Eve said. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point. The room did nothing. The room did it very thoroughly. Outside, the world made a sound like a tide waiting its turn." My phone did not vibrate because my phone was somewhere else. The second hand of a clock I could not see did not move in a way that could be counted. I realized, with the small physical shock one feels when the elevator stops on a floor you did not choose, that I could not have said whether 1 minute or 10 had passed. My body could. It had a little metronome under the heart that keeps score when the head is tired. It said, "A portion?" It said, "A slice." Detective Iliev's breath didn't change. She stood with her hands behind her back in the parade, rest of someone who trusts posture to keep more important things from escaping. Mr. Calvert watched us with the consideration he might have offered a pair of newer instruments. "Where does it go?" I asked. Nowhere," he said. "It gathers. People call it lost. It isn't. It is saved. We distribute it where it will be least. Destructive." "Saved by whom?" He inclined his head at the instruments. "By what you brought with you," he said. "Your attention. Your regret. Your tolerance for foregone conclusions. We harvest the minute you didn't use to say I'm sorry, the minute you didn't use to put down the knife, the minute you didn't use to say I love you until it was retconned into a joke. We keep the place from choking on its own almosts. And who decides where to put them?" she said. He was very still. "I do," he said. "The thing about authority is that it always believes it's a mirror. It says I am reflecting your best self. It is a window cut to the size of one face. Turn it off, Mara said. It isn't on, he said. Close it, she said. If you can open it, you can close it. If I close it, he said, and for the first time there was a hairline of fatigue in him no wider than a filament. The town will drown in its own unspent hours. People will be kind at the wrong time and cruel at the right one. They'll miss their trains and misread their children. They'll die early and late. They will blame the weather. They do that now, she said. Less, he said. Show me something that can be tested, she said. A claim with a number, a knob. I can turn that either stops the engine or doesn't. You're asking him to do a trick, I said. I'm asking him to subject himself to evidence, she said. Calvert looked past us, not unkindly, to the door. You want a number? He said. There's one coming. We waited because we were in a room where waiting was the only graceful act. Somewhere beneath our feet or above our heads, a bell we could not hear decided to be done. The air returned to its prior opinion. The instruments ceased, pretending they had separate personalities. I stepped off the disc and felt the small press of gravity that means your body is back where you left it. 3:17, he said. We stepped into the front room and an hour proceeded to be missing. The street outside had shifted one note up the scale. The light was wrong for the clock. The boy with the backpack was already walking home, and Mrs. Larkin had stacked a second tray she hadn't yet made when we entered. Detective Eliv looked at her watch not rudely, surgically, and then at the wall clock. The two did not argue. They refused to speak. An hour, he said to the detective, because I already knew it. Though knowing is an experience and not an understanding, the town cannot keep all of them. It keeps most. I take one. I return it later locally, surgically to people who are drowning. Who appointed you? She said. The same who appoints anyone who knows how to do something difficult in a place that needs it, he said. The market. The appetite. You created the appetite, she said. Correction isn't creation, he said. It is mercy. We stood three across in the shop like a moral problem. The case with the vials gleamed with its human coins. The scale on the bench balanced itself with the calm of someone who has already told the truth they plan to keep telling. What if I don't want your mercy? Mara said. You are not my client, he said. And, to me, bring the notebooks. Ms. Hall. No, I said. And it surprised me how good the word felt. Here's what will happen. I'll come back tomorrow with a list of names you owe hours to. You'll tell me where you plan to put them. Detective Eliv will stand in the doorway with a pen that makes official circles. If you don't like that, enjoy explaining a room that takes time in front of a judge who wakes at 5 to do puzzles. You are making this theatrical, he said. You already made it theater, she said. We're just selling tickets. His face did not change, and yet I understood that something in him, which had seen itself as inevitable, had found a pebble in one of its gears. "I will do one thing for you," he said to Mara, the way a man gives a bone to a dog and admires his own generosity. "At 4:17 today, the hour will return. I will place it more or less where I took it. You may stand wherever you like in town and watch where kindness lends. If you are not satisfied." The slightest tilt of his head, "Bring those bolt cutters." She looked at me. "Doorway," she said again. "Automatic." And we stepped out together. Outside, the town looked exactly like itself. Time had been mislaid and no one panicked because the town, like most, only notices what it is told not to ignore. We walked to the end of the block and stood in the corner of a puddle that had decided to be a mirror. Mara's phone buzzed. She did not answer. At 4:17, "We split," she said. "You go to the harbor. I'll go to the school crossing. If he's returning an hour, it will splash." "What are we looking for?" I asked. "Edits," she said. "Places where chance looks," rehearsed at 4:17. Hollowgate inhaled. It did it in a way that only bodice. Notice. The wind, which had been doing its own ungoverned private business all afternoon, folded its arms. The gull's cry landed on a different roof. Somewhere a door shut a second earlier than it had meant to and saved a cat its tail. I walked toward the water and saw a fisherman who had been about to back his truck into a bollard change, his mind as if someone had reminded him how corners work. A child tripped at the curb and did not fall. A stranger, his hand arrived where the ground would have been and returned him upright, as if he had remembered it himself. At the bait shop, the cashier looked up in time to see the man with the half-hidden bottle and cleared his throat. The bottle returned to the shelf with embarrassment, instead of to a pocket with a name. Small edits, not miracles. Tidying. I felt rage in me then. Not noble, not pure. It came from the part of me that had watched my mother's breath count down in a hospital where the clock did not resemble mercy. Who had he given her last hour to? Which stranger had been allowed to say something my mother had been denied by the arithmetic of her cells? My phone buzzed. "Mara." School crossing. A driver stopped. Would have kept going. Hard to prove. That's a point. I walked back to the shop with a speed that made the town blur. The green door was closed. The panel did not sigh. I knocked and it did not open. "Behind me," Mara said. "Doorway." And I said, "It won't." And then it did, and we were inside the small argument that thought it was a room. Mr. Calvert stood at the bench with his hands on either side of the scale as if warming them at a fire. "You saw it," he said. Not the question, pride pretending to be modesty. "I saw interference," Mara said. "A hand where a hand would not have been. A correction," he said. "A thief returning a fraction of what he stole," I said. He looked at me with that consideration again. "The one that takes the measure of your rage and decides whether it is expensive enough to honor." "Bring the notebooks," he said. "The town is drifting. Your mother knew where. I would prefer not to guess." "No," I said for the second time that day. and the word found my spine the way hooks find eyes. Here is a number you can write in your ledger. 27. That's how many minutes you say inheritance took from me without my permission. You will return them. Not at 4:17. Not dispersed across 24 strangers. So we all forget who owes what to me? In a way that can be counted, he regarded me the way a teacher regards a student who has both pleased and annoyed him. That isn't how it works, he said. Make it how it works, I said. He touched the scale with the back of his hand. The key in its dish did not tremble. Tomorrow, he said, at 3:17. Doorway, Mara said behind me, not as a reminder this time, but as a promise. And when I turned to leave, the town had already decided what it would ask of us next. The 27. Morning arrived, like a clerk with a clipboard, taking attendance of my thoughts. It ticked my fears, my anger, my mother's hand-drawn crescents, and the number 27 that had acquired the mass of a small planet. The mantle clocks agreed with the whole clock. The town's harmony had held through the night. As if a choir feared the conductor's temper, I brewed coffee that tasted like the decisions I was postponing and called Detective Eliva. At 8:07 the make see Liva Ea. Somewhere behind her, a radio murmured last night's weather, as if it were this morning's news. He promised tomorrow, I said, 3:17. To return the 27 minutes he claims I inherited without permission. That's leverage, she said. He's not good with being told to alter his rules. People like him dress rigidity in courtesy. When you made a demand, he translated it into an appointment. Do we make it? I asked. The appointment? We do, she said, and we don't go alone. I heard paper sliding, a pen tapping. Today, we prepare. I'll pull everything we have on him, on the shop, on the previous owner. If this goes back generations, there will be a seam in the paper as well as in the clocks. You believe him, I said, about the hour. About... I believe the evidence of my eyes, she said, not his theology. A pause. Do you want to believe him? I want a world where the missing hour explains why we all less kind than we meant to be. I said, it's prettier than the alternative. Pretty is contraband at work, she said. I'll pick you up at 11. Bring your mother's notebooks. You told me not to, I said. I told you not to give him the originals, she said. Bring them to me. A gull heckled the morning. I stood with the phone against my ear and understood that my day had just been divided into before and after again. Only the dividing line was an hour I could name. At 11, Detective Elive, unremarkable gray sedan, stopped at my curb and made a convincing case for its right to be ignored. She wore the same severe hair and a shirt that made a promise to an iron and kept it. In person by daylight, she looked less like a myth of competence and more like a person who had learned to be efficient with the soft parts. She eyed the stack of notebooks in my arms, then the brown paper counterfeit bundle on top. Good, she said. We'll copy what matters and keep the rest sleeping. Where to? I asked. Town hall, she said, distaste clipping the word town. Archives. Then the church. Then the harbor master. People leave their fingerprints on the kind of power they pretend not to believe in. Town hall smelled like paper forgiving people their sins. The clerk behind the glass had the pleasant defensiveness of someone who enjoys enforcing rules and dosing tea. Want you to think less of her for it. When the detective lifted her badge, the glass became a window. When she asked for the business license file for Calvert's horology, it became a door. The thin file was older than his face. It went back to 1989, the year of opening day in the photograph hand. Furthermore, before our Calvert, there had been Fenimore's Clock and Repair. And before that, Andix timepieces with a logo that looked like a bristling bird. The forms changed, the seals modernized, but one line stayed fossil still. Township contract, bell regulation, civic schedule maintenance, tower key custody. He had a key, I said aloud without meaning to. He has a key to the town's hours. It felt like an accusation and a confession. Custody? Mara Reed. Dry? The word people use when they don't want to say control. She thumbed forward to the most recent renewal. 11 months. 1 week. Same day as your mother's receipt? She said, looking at me under her lashes without moving her head. Settlement? I hate that word, I said. It pretends to be peace. She copied the license numbers, took photographs of the margins, circled nothing and yet marked everything. I pulled my mother's corrections ledger and laid it on the table. We looked at the small, fussy script together, her finger following the columns of loss and gain the way one follows a hymn. The kitchen clock, the porch clock, the stubborn mantle, in the right margins, crescents. In the left margins are Calvert Triton, crossed out. Written again, underlined once. She tried to balance without him, Mara said. She tried to mimic his grammar, I said. But she didn't want him inside the sentence. From Town Hall we walked to St. Brigid's the church. that even the godless used as a landmark. Its bell tower was stone in the manner of old promises. Its door wore the polish of generations begging and being proud. Father Doyle met us with the surprised hospitality priests adopt for cops and daughters. "Detective," he said, like a greeting he resented liking. "Miss Hale, your mother sang alto when she was young. A good ear. She could hold a line even if the sopranos were determined to mislead her." He shook his head at a private choir. "What can I do for you?" "Access to the epilogue," Mara said. "And any old complaints about the bell being wrong." He sighed. "Everyone is an expert at ringing in a town that can't stop telling time," he said. "But let us anyway to a side office that smelled like wax and old wood resolving their differences." He pulled a ledger that made my mother look profligate and set it down with the reverence of a holy book. Tuesdays were circled in red for a stretch of years. Bell correction by shop scrolled in the margin with 3 different hand sondics. Fenimores, and then Calvert's, printed neat as a ruler. 317. The priest said softly, tapping a date. All bells stilled at 317. "First time that note appears is about a year ago. The month Calvert went missing," I said. "Missing from potlucks," Father Doyle said wryly. "Not from work. Anyone who has ever been in charge of anything knows how to be missing without actually leaving." "Have there been complaints?" Mara asked. He smiled. "Not unkind. Priests grow from complaints the way trees grow from rain. People say the bells wake them, and they say the bells don't wake them, and both are my fault. But yes, since last fall, a steady trickle that doesn't trickle. Clocks won't hold their hours. Windows open themselves." The bell pauses at 317 like a man clearing his throat before a bad story. "Did my mother ever I began?" And then stopped, because the question was ridiculous and necessary. "Confess this." The priest regarded me like a man considering whether to open a drawer full of breakable things. "Your mother confessed grief," he said. "Everyone does, in different accents. She had one sin: precision. People who worship it are always certain they were 5 minutes late to mercy." In the tower, the bell ropes hung like arguments. Father Doyle offered a smile and declined to let us climb. "Insurance," he said. "And trust." At the door, he took my hand in both of his in the old liturgical way and said, "If the clockmaker tells you he is a priest of anything, do not tithe." The harbor master's office was half shed, half posture. A rectangular man with sunscreen in his eyebrows looked up from a ledger that needed therapy. "Ilive," he said without surprise. "Boat went down last week off the shoal. No bodies. Not your jurisdiction. Happy Thursday. We're not here for your dear," she said. "For once." "Then what?" he said. "Do you keep a tide book?" I asked, and he grunted like a man distracted from his culture. He heaved a binder onto the counter and slapped it open to a page that wore coffee like a tattoo. Tide Minima and Maxima, logged to the minute in his blocky hand. The columns were loyal. "Anything odd?" Mira asked. past year sees a mood," he said. "But yeah, there's a rub around 3 in the morning that wasn't there before." The gauges don't misread much, but they hesitate. Like the bays remembering something it can't put down. He scraped at a coffee ring with a thumbnail. "Why, you going to arrest the moon?" "Write it a ticket," she said. "How long is the hesitation?" "Hard to say," he said. "My guys call it the gulp." He pointed. "Here, here, here. Starts 11 months ago." He looked at me. "Your ma used to walk this wharf like it owed her uprightness. Haven't seen a woman check knots with that kind of disapproval since what happened here 11 months ago." I asked. "Boat," he said. "The master, Andine, pretty little sailor from up the coast, left before dawn against advice, fog like the beginning of the world." Her clock ran too fast. Her captain ran late. She hit the shoal wrong, and the sea was not in a forgiving mood. No fatalities. Someone got a line to them, but the keel took a scar like a story you regret telling. I saw it then, though I didn't want to. A map pinned through 3 points. The bell pause. The tide gulp. The licensed renewal aligning behind the translucent paper of the town's habits. 317 was not superstition. It was a bruise. Back in the car, we sat with the engine off. The town went about its business, which consisted mostly of making itself look inevitable. "Your mother's receipt," Mara said. "The boat's accident." The bells pause. The hour gathering room he showed us. He didn't pick 317 out of a hat. Something happened there that gave him a seam to what? "The accident," I said, "or something older." He mentioned an anniversary, but he respected. Seems more than sentiment. "Seems can be anniversaries," she said. She looked at my lap. The notebooks sat there, patient as children in a waiting room. "Let's copy, then we see if we can move a seam." We spread the ledgers across my mother's dining table. The way people spread maps before a campaign they have no right to attempt. We photographed every page, made index cards for entries that bore minor madness. Kitchen clock gains 37 seconds exactly per hour. Porch clock loses 10 seconds after noon. Mantle stops at 3:17 unless door held. We circled every crescent. We drew a timeline with 11 months and a week in bold. And beneath it settlement, licensed renewal, Andine grounded, bells stilled. It was a wall in a police show without the red string and with better handwriting. "What if we go there?" I said, touching the circle around the shoal. "At 3:17 tomorrow. Not to his shop. To the place the town gulps." Saying it made the breath leave me, as if the town had practiced an echo. "And do what?" Mara said. "Stand in the doorway," I said, and surprised myself with a laugh that wasn't entirely hopeful. "You told me once that's the safest place to be." "The safest place," she said, "is often where you can see the danger but it can't see you." She tapped the shoal on the map. "That's not it," Then we take both doorways, I said. You at the shop, me at the shore. We make him split his attention. We make him choose which seem to God. She eyed me, then the window, then the mantel clocks that were behaving with unnerving virtue. He won't like it, she said. That's a reason to do it. And today, I said, the 27. Today, she said, we make him pay you back in a currency he claims not to use. At 250. She dropped me at my mother's house with instructions that sounded like commandments. No tea he offers, no pen he hands you, doorway. She would go to the shop early, stand outside, make polite conversation with the green paint. If the panel opened before time, she'd slip into the narrow space and leave the door ajar with a pebble. If it didn't, she'd wait and hold it with her shoulder like a human doorstop the second it sighed. I walked to the harbor. The wind was a hand with opinions. The gulls were practicing their insults. The shoal lay in its shallow like an idea. The Master Onden's scar was not visible. But the stories around the bait shop had given it a shape I could recognize. The mark of going where you should not have. At a speed the sea did not endorse. At 3:10, my phone buzzed. Mara, in position. Another message arrived immediately after. Unknown. Punctuality is a form of respect. Ms. Hale. I pictured him in the back room, hands folded, face set in the benign omniscience of a person who likes being unavoidable. At 3:14, the harbor changed key. At 3:16, a gull corrected itself, mid-cry, to land on a different pylon. At 3:17 exactly, the wind forgot its obligations, and the tide performed the gulp. Not a sound, not a wave, but a decision the bay, reconsidering itself. My phone buzzed again, but the buzz came with the feeling of dislocation the room had taught me to recognize. The hour lowered itself like a ceiling. Return what your mother kept, I said to the water, because I didn't know whether I was pleading or issuing a command. The bay did the impolite thing of not answering. Then something happened that later I would not know how to persuade my own memory to believe. The shoal lifted, only a hand's breadth, as if taking a breath. And beneath it, in the narrow dark that was suddenly present and then not, I saw metal. Not a boat scar. A disc, a circle engraved, bright as the heart of a new coin, and in it a crescent set on its back like a smile. I waited without thinking. The water reached my knees, then cooled my thighs. The seafloor shifted, a polite but firm request that I respect physics. The disk was there, and then a seam of brightness, and then only a smear of light. The shoal exhaled and settled. 380 arrived like an ordinary minute. I stood dripping and furious in the not-quite surf. My phone buzzed again. Mara, doorway. He's late? That's new. Another buzz. Unknown. Inheritance. ISN. Theft. When it is agreed upon. At the time of need. He liked to define the terms while you were still learning the alphabet. I hurried back up the wharf, heart making its own bargains. By the time I reached Calvert's. The panel had sighed inward, and the detective was a wedge of personhood in the narrow space, holding the door not with a pebble but with her shoulder, as promised. Her face, composed to the public, held one uncomposed detail, a flush high on the cheekbones that was either effort or victory. "He didn't like splitting the seam," she murmured. "Did you see anything?" I asked. "A room that pretends not to start until he looks at it," she said. It blinked. She glanced at my wet jeans. "You." "A coin under the shoal," I said. His crescent. "I think the town has 2 keyholes. Then we'll use both," she said, "and let the panel open enough for us to slip inside." The front room's whispering had a hitch in it now, as if a choir member had swallowed badly. The light performed politeness and could not quite meet its own gaze. On the bench, the scale with my key in its dish was pitched a hair more toward. "True, Mr. Calvert," the detective said crisply. "We have a number to collect." He emerged from the back with an expression that would read as amusement to a person who believed in his benevolence and as irritation to anyone else. He took in my wet clothes, the detective's shoulder, the fractional angle of the scale. "You went to the shoal," he said to me. "Disappointment, busy making itself sound like concern. There are safer places to stand and make demands. There are safer ways to run a town." I said, "There are safer words than inheritance." He nodded once, not in agreement, but as if punctuating my sentence for me. "Very well," he said. "You want a test?" 27 minutes, localized, countable. I will return them to you now. "Here," Mara said. "Under observation," he smiled with his mouth and not his eyes. "Of course." He reached for the scale, slid the key and the small brass disc from their dishes, and set both on the bench with a care that suggested he did not trust the furniture to share his delicacy. From beneath the bench he drew the music box, the dark wood, the crescent of pearl, the negative moon keyhole that had eaten my 87 last night. He set it between us like a pet he'd trained to perform tricks without humiliating itself. "Miss Hale," he said, "stand here." He indicated a spot in front of the box that was just slightly off-center. I did not move. "Doorway," Mara said softly. "A benediction? A warning." "I'll stand where I stood yesterday," I said. "I'm not interested in new choreography." He inclined his head, the barest concession. "As you like." He slid my key toward me across the bench. "You'll turn it?" "Why?" I asked. "Because debt and return prefer the hand that's signed," he said. "Because you are a journalist and can count. Because if I turn it, you will say I tricked you, and if I turn it, I said, you'll say consent." I lifted the key and felt the metal's faint hum, the way it made my fingers warn each other a moment late. "If I turn this and you do not return the minutes, I will walk to the church and ring the bell until the town arrives with things that burn," I said calmly, and surprised both of us. He looked at me with an expression I had seen on men who have learned to respect the line between theater and riot. "Turn it," he said. I slid the key into the negative moon, feeling the chevrons seat themselves in their opposites with a soft satisfaction. 27, I said. because numbers are spells, and turned. The box did not breathe. It stalled, the way a breath stalls when a word is forgotten on the way out. The shop's whisper dipped and then righted itself. I felt a motion at my temples, a coolness behind my eyes, as if someone had opened a window in a warm house. A pressure, then ease, then the oddest sense of remembering something I had never done. The shape of a sentence I would one day speak with my mouth full of age. A porch. A hand. The phrase, "It's enough," said not with resignation, but with completion. It passed through me and out again and left a kind of absent-shaped relief. The minute hand of the mantel clock in the room behind us shifted. A small click that sounded louder than it was. The hall clock outside the shop door impossible to hear from here on any sane day seemed to say 3:80 in a voice I didn't like. "What did you just take?" I asked, throat dry. "Returned," he said, with the offended patience of a bureaucrat corrected by a poet. "You will receive them at the end, where they belong. But you won't be the same room when you get there. I want now," I said, not a promissory note stapled to my last day. "That isn't how it works," he said, gentle as a knife. "If I pour them into the middle, you'll drown in the present. 27 minutes all at once is an overdose of now. People do odd things when given surplus. They marry someone in a grocery line. They drive until the road becomes a story. They break what isn't broken to see how it works." "You're arguing that mercy requires withholding," Mara said. "That's a religion. I enforce laws. You enforce narratives," he said without rancor. "So do I." I wanted to hit him with something that would make a sound appropriate to the way his certainty felt against the bone of my day. Instead, I reached for the key. "Again," I said, "if this is theater, give me an encore." "It is not theater," he said, and placed his hand lightly over the key so that our skin did not meet, and we both knew it. "It is bookkeeping." "Doorway," Mara said a third time, and I realized she wasn't instructing me anymore. She was checking her own position in the one place in the shop where Levry lives. The shop's light tied itself a little to the corners. Outside, somebody laughed, and the laugh sounded like something our town had not yet paid for. I looked at the case of vials. Margaret Hale. 87 minutes still empty. Across the row, Ms. Broom, 14. S. Loon, 3. Names like small coins, debts like lint. Something in me that is not noble and not ignoble, the part that makes lists when frightened, decided to make a list with his tools. "You keep labels," I said. "You keep ledgers. You keep a room that eats hours. You keep a shoal coin under the town like a saint's bone. Now you're going to keep a promise to a person who was not your client." He met my eyes with a kind of crisp sadness. "You think I don't," he said. "You think I am a man in a tidy shop." I am the seam. I am the way this place remembers not to say the worst possible thing when it is most tempted. He gestured toward the door. Go home, Miss Hale, sleep. Tomorrow at 3:17. Stand where you stood today. We'll see whether your seam opens wider than mine. We'll be in both places, Mara said. He did not answer, which is how certain men say I expected as much. We stepped back into an afternoon that had the slightly polished look of something recently dusted. The panel slid inward without prompt and we were on the sidewalk, and the town's noise resumed its ordinary grammar like a stagehand dropping a curtain. We walked without agreement toward the corner because corners are how you reset. Did you feel it? I asked. I felt him keep his rules, she said. I felt you get angrier in a way that's going to be useful. I felt the shop twitch when the harbor took some of his attention. She stopped, and I felt something else you probably felt and didn't put words on. What I said. You recognized the phrase you will say at the end, she said. Everybody has one. Most don't get to hear it early. He made you hear the shape of yours. It's a trick, but it's not nothing. It didn't feel like a trick, I said. It felt like a door I'll eventually have to open, and I don't get a vote. We get a vote on when, she said. Not on that. She squinted down Hollow Street. The green door looked innocent. We'll need allies, she said. Not the kind who think the shop is haunted. The kind who know the bell rope calluses on their palms. The harbor master, I said. Father Doyle. The baker who wakes at 4. The boy with the backpack who knows when the crossing light lies. And someone from the Undine, she said. People who survive accidents carry maps. No one else can draw. You think they'll believe us, I said. They don't have to believe us, she said. They have to believe they've been paying a tithe to a man with a ledger and a smile. We parted at the corner with the professional affection of people who shared a problem and would share a courtroom if we lost. At home, the clocks were still behaving good. Boys who had learned not to steal meat from the counter but the house felt tilt as if waiting for me to walk to one side, so it could settle into a new truth. On the dining table, my mother's notebooks lay as we'd left them. I opened the top one. Not for the times, not for the corrections, but for the margins. The crescent after Porch Cluse's 10 seconds after noon had a smudge beside it, as if her hand had paused. In that smudge, where no words were meant to go, there were words that had not been there this morning. Don't give him the church. Don't give him the sea. Her script. Not the tidy daytime one, but the late-night version when tea cooled and sentences admitted they were afraid. You're late, I said to the empty room, and did not mean my mother. The house breathed the way old houses do when they think you've finally noticed how long they'd been holding something. The hall clock looked innocent. The mantel ticked like agreement. The porch clock chimed once, then again, as if reconsidering its own certainty. I took a pen and wrote under her warning, "What do I give him?" No answer wrote itself, which is a kind of answer. I could hear the harbor through the window if I pretended, the town adjusting its weight. People forgiving and regretting on schedule. At 7:03, the door knocked with the 3 and 2 that had become the sound my day wore to dinner. I did not startle. I opened it and found a girl on the step. 15 maybe? With hair that had already decided to argue with adult rules and a backpack that had been asked to carry a life. "You're Nora," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Sometimes," I said. "Who are you?" "Anya Fenimore," she said. Chin set the way people set their chins when they are repeating a story that has been talked over. My granddad used to run the clock shop before Calvert took over. He says you're going to break the room. "Your granddad called you," I said. "He told me to tell you something," she said. "He thought if he went, you'd be polite." "I don't do polite." She hooked her thumb under her backpack strap, the universal sign of people about to say a thing unadorned. Granddad says, "The shop's not the heart, it's the vein. The heart's under." The stone under the bell is a second door. I thought of my mother's smudged note. "Don't give him the church. Don't give him the sea." "Does your granddad know that because he kept the town's time?" I asked. "Or because he helped make the seam?" "Yes," she said, and I liked her immediately. "Tell him thank you," I said. "Tell him to stay home at 3:17 tomorrow." "You going to break it?" she asked, with the unkind hope of the honest. "I'm going to stand in both doorways," I said, "and see which one blinks first." She squinted past me into the hall. "Your clocks are loud," she said. "They're trying to be good." I said. "Gross," she said, and shouldered her backpack like a verdict. At the gate, she turned. "Granddad says the room doesn't like music." "What kind of music?" I asked. "The wrong kind," she said. "The kind that doesn't keep time. He says if you have to choose a song to break a metronome, choose something that doesn't rhyme with a watch." The door shut behind her with a sense of humor. "That night I made a list because rage without a list is just mood allies. Father Doyle, Harbor Master, Mrs. Larkin, the baker, Anya, anyone from the Endine. Objects, my key, his box, the bell loop, the shoal coin, the photograph, warnings, the church, the sea, rules, doorway, no pens, no tea tray, music that doesn't rhyme with a watch." I slept with the notebooks under the bed the way children sleep with their shoes by the door in case of fire. The house arranged its noises to reassure me, then failed, then tried again, sometime deep into the night. I woke to the sound of a metronome trying to reassert itself and the very quiet sound of a woman in the kitchen, measuring flour with a high and disapproving grace. "Don't give him the church," I said into the dark, and the dark said nothing back, which is when people believe themselves most. In the morning, as punctual as the town demanded, Mara texted Mass at St. Brigid's, de Salto, M. Then the harbor. Then we split. "Bring whatever song doesn't rhyme with a watch," I wrote back. "I'll bring a hymn that never met a metronome." She sent a thumbs up, which is how modern detectives consecrate a plan. On the way out, the porch clock chimed once, then, after a small pause that meant something, it chimed again. The 2 doorways. The church smelled like stone that had been spoken to for centuries. St. Brigid's pews were half filled with the faithful and the habitually punctual, and Father Doyle stood at the altar giving a homily about forgiveness. That made me wonder if he knew more about time than he admitted. Mara sat 2 rows behind me, not bowing, not singing, but attending with the respectful boredom of a woman cataloging exits. At exactly 10:32, when the bells tolled the half hour, a tremor passed through the stone beneath our feet. It wasn't earthquake strong, just the polite insistence of a hand tapping the shoulder of the town. The bells rang 1 note sharp, then corrected themselves. No one else flinched. My mother's warning inked itself on my memory again. "Dante, give him the church. Don't give him the sea." After Mass, Father Doyle drew us aside. His eyes were grave, but not surprised. "You've been in the room," he said to me. "Not a question." "Yes," I said. "Then you know the shop is only antechamber," he said. "The bell tower is older than Fenimore, on the Calvert. The stone beneath the bell has been corrected and corrected until it remembers only correction. If he ever sets his hand there, the town will ring his hour forever." Marat's voice was clipped. "Then we won't let him." At noon, we met allies at the harbor. Mrs. Larkin brought bread wrapped in wax paper, as if feeding us might count as defense. The harbor master leaned on his ledger like a weapon, and Anya Fenimore arrived dragging her backpack, unapologetic. "My granddad says you'll need someone who isn't afraid to call him a liar," she said. "That's me." Mara didn't argue. She parceled out roles the way generals do when the war is mostly theory until the first shot. "2 doorways," she said. "Nora at the shoal. I'll be in the shop. Father Doyle stays in the tower to keep him from touching stone. The rest of you watch you witness. If something breaks, run toward it." It sounded like a plan, which is the most fragile disguise for hope. The day bruised itself into evening. Clouds lowered. The town exhaled the kind of silence that feels staged. At 3:05, I walked down to the water with Anya beside me. She carried nothing but a portable speaker the size of her palm. "Granddad says the room hates music," she reminded me. "What kind?" I asked. The kind that refuses to keep time. At 3:10, Mara texted, "In position? Doorway? Ready?" At 3:14, the wind turned its head. At 3:16, the tide hesitated. At 3:17, the seam opened. The shoal lifted a fraction, revealing the disc engraved with its crescent. At the same moment, the panel at Calvert's shop sighed inward, and the bells of St. Brigid's clanged half a note sharp and then in net. He was trying to claim all three at once. "Now," I said. Anya tapped her speaker. A song leaped out, discordant, jagged, the guitar line staggering, refusing rhythm. Punk, raw, ugly, beautiful because it broke every rule a metronome ever loved. The shoal shivered. The disc flickered like light underwater. The seam complained. I put the key my kin to the air above the disc. It didn't need a lock. Better as it none. The chevrons found grooves I couldn't see. I turned. The sea howled, not with wind, not with wave, but with the sound of an account being ripped open. Later, Mara would tell me the shop buckled inward at the same instant, its whispering turning to panic. She held the doorway with her whole body as Calvert shouted calmly, always calmly, that I was undoing a balance older than my family's blood. Father Doyle would swear the bell ropes writhed like snakes, but his grip held, and the tower did not bow. At the shoal, the disc flared once bright enough to blind. Then it cracked down its center with the sound of a ledger torn in half. Water swallowed it, furious, then closed, smooth as if hiding evidence. And in my chest, something shifted. Oh wait, 27 minutes settled back. I felt them not as numbers, but as texture. Breaths I hadn't been allowed. Sentences I would someday finish. My pulse stuttered, then steadied. My body knew it had been amended. Anya whooped, hair whipping in the storm the shoal's anger made. He hated that. She shouted over the feedback of her speaker. Granddad says you broke his vein. When I staggered into the shop doorway 10 minutes later, soaked and salt-stung, Mara was still inside. Calvert stood across the bench, his hands folded, his face composed, but there was a crack in his neatness, the smallest falter in a man who had always counted everything. You can't keep two doorways open against me, he said. We just did, Mara said, and we'll keep doing it. His eyes found me, dripping, defiant, the keys still humming in my hand. For the first time, he looked older. Not ageless, not inevitable, just a man who had carried too many ledgers and thought they made him immortal. This town will drown without correction, he said softly. Or maybe it will finally learn to swim. I said. The shop whispered uneasily. Clocks disagreeing again. Mara stepped forward, pen in hand like a blade. Your contract with the town is finished. No more custody. No more inheritance. For a moment, I thought he might laugh. Instead, he inclined his head, as if acknowledging a rival conductor. Then he stepped back into his hidden hall, and the door closed behind him not with finality, but with retreat. That night, Hollowgate's clocks argued like siblings, and no one corrected them. The bells rang true and false, and no one died for it. The tide moved without hesitation, forgiving itself. At my mother's house, I opened her last notebook. The margins were blank. No crescents, no warnings, just space. I took a pen and drew one crescent of my own, not as imitation, but as declaration. Correction. None. I closed the book. At 3:17, I woke not to a knock, not to a call, but to silence, a silence that belonged to me. After the hour, Hollowgate learned to miscount itself and did not die. The first week after the two doorways broke each other's confidence, the town behaved like a house after guests leave. Doors ajar, glasses in the sink, relief louder than anyone admitted. The streetlights hummed without waiting for permission. The harbor forgot to gulp. Mrs. Larkin's bread rose when it wanted to and tasted like sleep well kept. People were late and early and sometimes right on time, and none of it felt like a sin, only like weather. The clocks argued. Not dramatically, not like a chorus that has decided to revolt. More like family. A little sharp here, a little flat there. Each insisting on an opinion that didn't need to be corrected to be lived with. Father Doyle rang the bells with a human hand instead of a borrowed rhythm, and the tower was grateful. You could hear gratitude in the slight wobble of the rope when a child was allowed to pull once on a weekday and declare it holy. Detective Mara Hale wrote the kind of report that would be mocked by any city desk and filed without comment by any town clerk who had been taught to read between pages. It said words like unlicensed, custody withdrawn, public nuisance, and one clean sentence that I admired as if it had been carved. Henceforth, schedule is a civic consensus, not a private franchise. The council, which had for years pretended it didn't really understand what it was signing every April, voted to dissolve the contract with Calvert's Horology. They did this with a solemnity that made everyone in the room want to laugh, and didn't he? Power, when it returns to the commons, always looks a little underdressed. People came to me the way they go to bakers and mechanics and priests when something changes and they want a story that makes the change into a choice they helped make. A widow who had paid for an hour to say, ghosted at my gate and admitted, without crying, that she had said stay instead and regretted it but did not want a refund. A fisherman asked if the tide would keep appointments now or prefer a looser social calendar. A boy with a backpack asked whether detention counted differently. If the clock in the principal's office was 5 minutes fast, and I told him to talk to his conscience and then admitted that my conscience had often been late to important meetings. enough anymore became my favorite interruption. She would knock with the impatient rhythm of someone unwilling to be expected and sit on my porch steps with a kinked grin and news. Granddad says Calvert boxed up his arrogance and moved it 3 towns over. Granddad says the shop is older than stone once you remove them in. Granddad says if you want to keep a clock honest, you don't wind it. You listen to it. We went into the shop once with a warrant shaped like a locksmith. The green paint looked tired, which is how paint looks when it has had to pretend to be a person. Inside, the front room felt not abandoned so much as retired. Benches laid off, glass cases relieved of duty, the air assessing how much of itself to use now that it didn't have to whisper. The case of vials was empty, each label gone, each shelf bare. As if a careful thief had stolen not the minutes but the evidence that minutes had once been treated like coins. The ledger settlement wasn't there. He had taken his nouns with him. We found the missing hour room, but it didn't behave. The instruments stood at their stations like tools in a museum that had lost the plaque explaining what they were for. The metal disc in the center held numbers that no longer negotiated. They sat like neighbors who had decided to move. When Mara stepped onto it, nothing happened. The room did not gather. It did not wait. It had the exhausted dignity of a theater after the last performance. When the chairs remember sitting and the stage remembers feet, underneath St. Brigid's, Father Doyle led us to the stone other priests had been taught not to name. It wasn't magic. It was older than magic, which is to say it had once been ordinary. The surface held grooves worn smoothed by hands and ropes and weather. In one corner, a crescent had been carved and then rubbed back into ambiguity. People, the priest said, laying his palm flat on the stone, will always want someone to keep time for them. I propose we take turns. At the shoal, the disc did not reappear. On a low-tide day, if you knew exactly where to look and had the kind of eyesight fishermen grow in their bones, you could see a paler patch where the sand had accepted a secret and agreed to keep it for a reasonable fee. The harbor did not hesitate anymore at 317. It rained when it meant to and refrained when it didn't. Tea. The master Andy sailed past on a clear morning with a patched keel and a captain who had learned a new word for humility. As for my 27 minutes, he returned them the way he said he would. To the end, where I would not see them except a shape that should have angered me more than it did. But some mornings I woke with the sense of a sentence fitted better in my mouth. It's not resignation. The way a house settles when it finally trusts the soil it stands on. My mother's notebook stayed under my bed for a while, like good children awaiting a bus. When I finally brought them to the dining table, it wasn't to copy or catalog or ceremonialize. I read them like letters, which is what they had always been. In the margins, crescents stopped appearing. In the final pages, her corrections loosened. Porch clock loses 10 seconds after noonlighted. Kitchen clock gains 37. And I will compensate with cake. In the last line, a sentence not for any clock and not for any ledger. Dear Nora, we were never on time. We were together. I printed the photographs opening day at Calvert's. My mother's smile still secret. The later one of the two of them in front of his green door, each imagining a future they could balance with instruments. I put them in a drawer. Not because I was ashamed, not because I wanted to forget, but because I wanted them to be there when forgetting pretended to be easier than remembering. Sometimes I take them out and introduce them to the light like old coins rubbed shiny by palms. Detective E-Leaf started showing up to the bakery earlier. Mrs. Larkin saved her 2 rolls, without asking a bribe disguised as kindness or the other way around. The detective and I walked Hollow Street on afternoons when weather tried to practice and talked about nothing in particular, which is what you do with people you trust in a town you trying to teach not to outsource its conscience. She cut her hair shorter, not as an emblem, but the town read it as one anyway. The town council elected a new clerk with a handwriting that refused to be fussy. Contracts got longer and plainer. People made peace with the idea that the bell might ring off by a minute, and that minute belonged to no one and to everyone. At 3:17, sometimes a baby cried, and sometimes a man put down his hammer, and sometimes a woman who had been nursing a grudge took a breath and put it back on the shelf. None of it could be proven. All of it felt like weather we made together. As for Calvatar horologist, corrector of drifts, man of polite arrogance to Z, did not vanish. Men like that don't vanish. They harvest new neighborhoods. A letter arrived addressed to me in a hand that would always love rulers. It contained a single line. To abandon an instrument is not to abandon its purpose. No signature. He had given up needing me to acknowledge authorship. I put the letter with the photographs. I wanted my archives to agree about what had happened. We had stopped paying a tithe to a man with a smile and a ledger, and in return the town had taken back the risk of being wrong and the right to be forgiven without a receipt. I keep one clock in my mother's house a little fast on purpose. Another a little slow. The whole clock is very precise for a week and then sulks. The mental clock, that once stuck at 3:17, now pauses at random like a child holding a secret and then confesses without prompting. When people visit, they ask me, which is correct. Whichever one you decide to obey, I say. Anya brings over songs. Some the shop would have hated. Some the bell learns to love. She wants to leave as soon as she's old enough to drive out of town and tell other towns they should not hire their hours out to men with neat hair. I tell her to go. I tell her to come back. I tell her to send postcards with times of day on them she thinks would scandalize St. Brigid's. On fog days, Hollowgate disappears into itself. The harbor becomes an idea. The street lights grow halos. In that pale weather, I sometimes feel the ghost of the missing hour room at my back, not threatening, only reminding. I imagine its instruments covered with cloth, the way museums cover their relics when they renovate, waiting for an era that deserves them less. I hope we never do. When I think of my mother now, it's not in minutes borrowed and paid back. It's in the way she held a list like a kindness and a discipline at once. It's in the smudge her thumb made beside a crescent she drew and then rubbed into suggestion. It's in pies with too much lemon and letters that arrive after funerals and the ordinary, uncorrected hour between a knock Hollowgate is no better than it was. That is not how towns work. We are still late to the right things and early to the wrong. Still cruel when tired and generous when watched. But we are our. And when the bell rings a little off at 3:17, people smile without counting, because the story has taken the place of a rule, and stories are heavier and harder to steal. On my porch, the brass clock chimes once and then, as if reconsidering its own certainty, chimes again. I let it. I sit with a cup that will cool if I don't pay attention. And I pay attention, and sometimes I don't. There is no ledger. There is no settlement. There is the hour that is here, and the one after it. And if I am lucky enough to reach the end with a sentence I recognize in my mouth, I hope it will be the one I heard once when a man tried to own my minutes and failed. It's enough, and if the door knocks 3, then 2. At some future dawn, I will answer like a person who owes no one his favorite number. The clockmaker is gone, but the town still ticks. Some clocks run fast, others slow, and no one dares correct them anymore. Because Hollowgate has learned that time is not a debt to be paid. It is a gift to be lived. And when the bells ring a little wrong at 3:17, people smile, knowing the story belongs to them now.